The desert sand whipped across Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison's face as he pressed his back against the concrete barrier, his left leg screaming in agony. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around his thigh, and every breath sent sharp pains through his cracked ribs. The explosion that had taken out his Humvee 20 minutes ago had left him separated from his team, alone in hostile territory with nothing but his sidearm and his training. Jake had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years, serving in some of the most dangerous theaters of operation around the world. Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Syria. He'd seen it all and survived it all. At 38, he was one of the most decorated operators in SEAL Team 6, with 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross that he'd earned during a classified operation in Syria that had saved 43 American hostages. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was staying alive long enough to reach the extraction point that was still 8 miles away through Taliban-controlled territory. His radio had been damaged in the blast, and his GPS unit showed a cracked screen that flickered between satellite signals. He was operating on pure instinct and 15 years of combat experience. The mission had started like any other. Intelligence had indicated a high-value target was meeting with several Taliban commanders in a compound 30 miles outside Kandahar. Jake's team had been tasked with surveillance and possible elimination if the opportunity presented itself. They'd been inserted under cover of darkness, moving through the rugged terrain with the silence and precision that had made Navy SEALs legendary. Everything had gone according to plan until they'd hit that improvised explosive device on the way back to the landing zone. The blast had flipped their armored vehicle and scattered his 5-man team across 100 yards of rocky desert. Jake had watched helplessly as his teammates, all unconscious or worse, had been loaded into Taliban vehicles that had appeared within minutes of the explosion. Now, as the sun climbed higher in the Afghan sky, Jake knew he was running out of time. The Taliban fighters who had taken his team would be searching for him, and his injuries were slowing him down significantly. He needed help, but his pride and his training told him to handle this alone. SEALs didn't ask for help. SEALs were the help that other people called for. He pulled himself to his feet, using the concrete wall for support, and surveyed the terrain ahead. The landscape was a mix of rocky outcroppings and sandy valleys, with scattered villages that could either provide shelter or become death traps. His water supply was running low, and the Afghan heat was already becoming unbearable, even though it was still early morning. Jake had survived worse situations than this. During his second deployment to Iraq, he'd spent 3 days behind enemy lines after his helicopter had been shot down. In Somalia, he'd single-handedly held off an attacking force for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. He'd been trained to operate alone, to survive in hostile environments, and to complete his mission regardless of the obstacles. But this felt different. The pain in his leg was getting worse, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each step. The blood loss was more significant than he'd initially thought, and he was beginning to show signs of shock. His hands were trembling slightly, and his vision occasionally blurred at the edges. As he moved carefully through the rocky terrain, Jake's mind drifted to his family back home in Virginia Beach. His wife, Sarah, was probably getting ready for work at the hospital where she served as a trauma nurse. His 2 children, Emma and Tyler, would be getting ready for school, completely unaware that their father was fighting for his life on the other side of the world. He'd missed Tyler's baseball game last week because of this deployment, and Emma's school play was coming up in 2 months. He'd promised them both that he'd be there, but SEALs learned early not to make promises they couldn't keep. The nature of their work meant that family always came second to the mission, and Jake had missed more birthdays, anniversaries, and school events than he cared to count. The sound of vehicles in the distance snapped Jake back to the present. He quickly took cover behind a large boulder, pressing himself against the rock and controlling his breathing. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see 2 pickup trucks filled with armed fighters moving slowly along a dirt road about a quarter-mile away. They were searching for him, methodically checking every possible hiding spot. Jake checked his ammunition. He had 2 full magazines for his sidearm and 1 spare. 45 rounds total. Against the dozen fighters he could see, and probably more that he couldn't, it wouldn't be enough for a prolonged firefight. He needed to avoid contact and keep moving toward the extraction point. The trucks passed by without detecting him, but Jake knew they'd be back. The Taliban fighters were experienced hunters, and they knew this terrain better than he did. They'd set up a search pattern that would eventually find him unless he could reach friendly territory first. As he prepared to move out, Jake heard something that made him freeze. The distinctive sound of American helicopters in the distance. His heart leaped with hope before his tactical mind took over. It could be a search and rescue mission looking for him and his team, or it could be another operation entirely. Either way, he needed to signal them without giving away his position to the Taliban fighters who were still in the area. Jake pulled out his signal mirror, a small piece of reflective metal that every SEAL carried for emergency situations. He angled it carefully, trying to catch the morning sun, and send a flash toward the helicopters. One flash meant friendly forces present. 2 flashes meant immediate assistance required. 3 flashes meant hostile forces in the area. He sent the sequence twice. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3. Then, he waited, watching the helicopters through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. For a moment, it seemed like they might have seen his signal. One of the helicopters banked slightly in his direction before continuing on its original course. Jake's shoulders sagged with disappointment. They hadn't seen him, or if they had, they couldn't respond without compromising their own mission. He was still on his own, still 8 miles from safety, still bleeding and running out of time. The next 3 hours were a blur of careful movement through increasingly hostile territory. Jake moved from cover to cover, using every piece of concealment the terrain offered. His SEAL training had taught him to become invisible when necessary, to move through enemy territory like a ghost. But his injuries were making stealth increasingly difficult. He'd stopped twice to re-bandage his leg wound, using strips torn from his uniform shirt. The bleeding had slowed, but hadn't stopped entirely, and the pain was becoming harder to ignore. His ribs ached with every breath, and he was pretty sure at least one was cracked, possibly broken. Around midday, Jake reached a small village nestled in a valley between 2 ridgelines. Intelligence reports had indicated that this particular village was neutral, with residents who generally avoided involvement in the conflict between coalition forces and the Taliban. But intelligence reports could be wrong, and walking into a village alone and injured was a massive risk. He spent 30 minutes observing the village from a concealed position on the ridge above. He could see women tending to children, men working in small fields, and the normal activities of rural Afghan life. No obvious signs of Taliban presence, no military-age males carrying weapons, no unusual activity that might indicate a trap. Jake was weighing his options when he spotted something that changed everything. A small convoy of vehicles was approaching the village from the east. Through his damaged binoculars, he could make out the distinctive profile of American military vehicles. A Marine patrol was heading directly toward the village. This was his chance. Marines and SEALs had a complicated relationship. There was mutual respect, but also fierce rivalry between the services. Marines thought SEALs were prima donnas who got all the glory for doing the same job. SEALs thought Marines were too rigid in their tactics and relied too heavily on overwhelming firepower instead of precision. But right now, Jake didn't care about inter-service rivalries. Those Marines represented safety, medical attention, and a way home. He began making his way down the ridge toward the village, moving as quickly as his injured leg would allow. As he got closer, Jake could see that it was a small patrol, 3 vehicles with maybe a dozen Marines total. They were moving in a standard patrol formation, with one vehicle providing overwatch while the others entered the village. Professional, competent, but not the overwhelming force that Jake would have preferred for his rescue. Jake was still 500 yards from the village when everything went wrong. The distinctive crack of sniper rifles echoed across the valley, and he watched in horror as the lead Marine vehicle erupted in flames. The Taliban had been waiting, using the village as bait for exactly this kind of patrol. The remaining 2 Marine vehicles immediately took defensive positions, returning fire toward the ridgeline where muzzle flashes marked sniper positions. Jake could see Marines dismounting and moving into cover positions around the village. They were outnumbered and caught in a well-planned ambush. Every instinct Jake had developed over 15 years of combat operations told him to stay hidden, to wait for the firefight to end, and then approach whoever was left standing. He was injured, low on ammunition, and in no condition to